Well, millions of Americans are preparing to hit the roads or skies for Thanksgiving this week. Two storms are expected to hit parts of the U.S., which could upend plans for millions. Western Mass News reporter Taylor Smith joins us live in the studio. And Taylor, what do travelers need to be aware of this week?
Well, Amanda, there's certainly a possibility we'll be heading into some travel disruptions as 6 states in the West have been placed under winter weather alerts. Now, even with several feet of snow forecasted in some areas, AAA is still estimating a record-breaking 80 million people to be traveling at least 50 miles this week, with millions more expected to fly. And as the storm heads east, the start of this week, it is expected to bring light rainfall, but the U.S. officials are still urging travelers to pack their patience as delays are still expected to occur.
TSA is expecting a potentially record-breaking holiday travel season. If recent experience is any guide, these will likely be some of the busiest travel days in U.S. history.
Now, as millions of Americans prepare to travel, staying informed and being patient will essentially get us all through the busy holiday season. Reporting live in the studio this morning, Taylor Smith, Western Mass News.
All right, Taylor.